So the next film we're going to review is Josephine Decker's next film, Shirley. It premiered at Sundance.
To our suffering, my dear.
There's not enough scotch in the world for that.
Shirley, what are you writing now?
A little novella. I'm calling none of your goddamn business.
Well, you were invited to stay here for a few days until we could find a place.
Shirley has these bouts.
She's gone sick in the head.
I read your story.
What are you doing in here?
It made me feel thrillingly horrible.
Do you know what it's like to have a secret?
Carice, why don't you tell us a little bit about the film?
So Shirley is the fourth feature from American filmmaker Josephine Decker, whose previous film, Madeline's Madeline, premiered at the BFI London Film Festival. So we can only imagine that Shirley would have maybe got a similar place at a UK film festival had they still been running. All of Decker's work plays with the experimental mode of filmmaking. So she's sort of done psychological thrillers and erotica and stuff before, but she's really, really skilled at bringing in kind of experimental techniques. Her latest film, Shirley, which stars Elizabeth Moss in the title role, brings experimental techniques to the genre of the biographical drama. The biography in focus is that of horror writer Shirley Jackson, who many may know as the writer of The Haunting of Hill House that was adapted for Netflix last year. Shirley the film's not your typical biographical feature, however, and it drops the traditional format of filmmaking, throwing in horror elements, mystery, thriller storylines, and effectively all just takes place in one single household with an older couple and a younger couple, a trope that's used in films such as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, or Mother, Darren Aronofsky's film, and shows the tension between the two sets of couples, but also across couples, kind of tearing apart the relationships. It's a great film that kind of keeps you on your toes, goes off in all sorts of strange directions, but I think of all the Josephine Decker's work, it shows her kind of bringing her experimental mode into something that is probably quite digestible by many of your kind of regular film-going audiences. And I think that's done through things such as the mystery storyline, giving something to focus on whilst all this other kind of chaotic activities happening around it. What did you think of it, Amanda?
I agree. I think I really liked Madeline's Madeline, and this film felt more approachable to perhaps people who wouldn't be into like more of an experimental film about experimental theater in New York. But I also went to a school in Vermont that was very similar to like the kind of the environment and the backdrop of this story. I liked the fact that she was able to use kind of the soundscape and the close-ups and shallow depth of field to create a biopic story that was also part fiction, part nonfiction based on this novel that she found, and play with that. And I think that was really, really enjoyable. I think I might have preferred her previous film a little bit more, but that didn't mean I didn't enjoy it and didn't kind of feel that she captured that energy that would be an academics and the life kind of trauma of a woman who lives in that world and yet is trying to write and sort of deal with the psychological issues of being a woman who had that lifestyle. I read a little bit about her biography and I was really fascinated by the story because it inspired me to. What were your thoughts, Jim?
Yeah, I enjoyed this. I think, well, if enjoyed is indeed the right word. I think I'm a little bit similar to what you were hinting at there, Amanda, in that I do think I thought Madeline was better. I do think I think I just feel like some of Josephine Decker's stylistic elements, like the extreme close-ups, shallow depth of field, all this sort of thing. I felt it worked with the story in Madeline better. What I will say is that film combined with Shirley does make me want to go back and check out Butter on the Latch in particular, because these are the only two films of Josephine Decker's that I've seen. That being said, I think there's a lot of elements that work very well together here. I think Elizabeth Moss has excellent screen presence at the best of times, but I think she's also playing a character which is quite different to some of the other things that I've certainly seen her in recently, and I think she does a very good job with this kind of like playing this very abrasive personality. In terms of how it represents Shirley Jackson herself, I don't really know, because in all honesty, I don't really know Shirley Jackson at all. I've never read any of her books or short stories. I've not seen The Haunting of Hill House. The only thing of hers that I have seen, but I didn't know it was at the time, is there was a film which screened at Edinburgh Film Festival last year, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is based upon a book of hers. And certainly there's something about the tone, like, if I assume that film kept some of the tone from the novel, there is certain aspects of where that tone comes from, which seems to have been clarified by watching this and seeing a window into the personality. Something that actually reminded me of a little bit in that respect, because it's based upon a novel, as you mentioned, where it's got real elements, but it blends in this narrative mystery stuff. It actually reminded me a little bit of We Need to Talk About Kevin, in the sense that you could be worried with it being a literary adaptation. I think it's the first time Josephine Decker's not directed from her own script. You could be worried about, like, this distinctive style of the filmmaker maybe getting lost, in the same way that I think you could have, in advance, made the same thing about Lynn Ramsey in this very particular structure that the book We Need to Talk About Kevin had. I don't think that's happened. I think it is, to me, even on the basis of that one other Josephine Decker film I've seen, it's very clearly a Josephine Decker film. So I think one thing that is quite good about it, as somebody who has liked the previous work of hers that I've seen, is it still very much retains that style, and I think it adds to the story. Do I think it works quite as effectively here as it did with Madeline's Madeline? For me, maybe not, but it's still a very effective film. I think it's very well made. I don't think I really got as wrapped up in the kind of like the mystery elements as, the story about like the grad student who disappears and kind of like, what's happened there, and that forming the bedrock of like the new work that Shirley in the story is working on, which I understand goes on to develop into one of her actual books that was written. But for me, I didn't get quite as wrapped up in that. I found I got a little bit more out of it when the stylistic elements were blending with, in particular, Elizabeth Moss's performance to kind of give a bit of a window into her psyche. And that's what I like, and I don't think that's a coincidence, because that's what I liked about Madeline's Madeline. So for me, those are the bits I liked, and it didn't work quite as well on that basis, but it's still a very effective, very skilled piece of filmmaking, I would say.
Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I find this interesting because Decker's films, or at least the ones I've seen, which is Madeline's Madeline, Thou Was Mild and Lovely, the one she did after Butter on the Latch, which I haven't seen. They're all films I admire but don't quite love, and this is the closest I've got to loving one of her films, really. Maybe it's just Elizabeth Moss in part, because I love when Elizabeth Moss plays a very fiery, hard shell exterior character. I always enjoy these performances, particularly the one she did last year in Her Smell, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. Here, and as we've mentioned, everything in the house, which is shot with a very particular lens, so that you get these, as mentioned, a very shallow depth of field, so that you're in her headspace in a way. You touched on sound design, which is crucial for this, because in certain scenes, all you can hear is the sounds from outside, and it's almost as though the town outside her door is one of her fictions. Like, it doesn't actually exist. If it exists beyond her, it has to have been made by her, because it's so strange and so weird. I'll say that I really like the the trade-offs that she and Michael Stuhlbarg give each other as scene partners. I find there's just a very discomforting relationship that they have, but there's a kind of, they like one-upping each other quite a lot. I like particularly how Michael Stuhlbarg's character, the professor, he's so slimily agreeable, if that makes sense. He's so like he has such an annoying register of being agreeable while also putting obligations on people. So there's a moment where he's talking to the character who comes along to stay at the house for a while, and says, "You won't pay room and board, but could you help out around the house, please?" And the way that this is done is this awful mixture of no, absolute politesse, but then also, "Oh, but please, you do need to help us." And that little switch that Spielberg does is so good. I would say the other two performances are a bit blanker purposefully, and that's interesting because then you get how Shirley affects them and affects their presence in the house. Where it falls off for me a wee bit is in the matter of the story, which is the novel she's writing is Hangsaman, and what the narrative essentially posits is that parts of the character are informed by Shirley, parts of the character are informed by the transplant into the house, and that seems, not to use the word obvious, it does seem obvious. To me, that's a pretty standard literary biopic, literary fictional trope in these sorts of movies, and that's kind of consistent with the experience I've had with Decker's films, which is the narratives always in some way peak a while before the end, and then it's just a slow peter off. But it is the film I've enjoyed by her most so far.
I agree with the relationship and the way that the two main characters, the husband and wife, are interacting. And I think I remember the table scene. There was one like table scene where all four of them are there, and the way it was shot, just sort of from like, again, these close-ups, but just kind of like you could feel the tension of the four characters, and then continually they went back to this table as time goes by. Again, this also use of seasons and I also, what you bring up this idea of like the sounds outside affecting Shirley. I think about this like living in Vermont in this very isolated sort of way, and the town gown relationships with these institutions and the relationships of being a writer, being respected for being a writer. The husband, again, looking into his past, he did have a real misunderstand, like an idea of what a woman should do, and so he treated his wife in a way that caused her to have that kind of frustration, and she took that out in her work, and all of this was expressed through sound and through visuals and through and she did that so well with Madeline's Madeline, and she did that so well here, so very, very effective in that way.
I'm really pleased you've mentioned the sound, actually, because it's something we spoke about when we reviewed Madeline's Madeline, and it gets mentioned, but I don't feel it's an aspect of those two films that is really spoken about enough, to be honest with you, because I think in particular in kind of like getting into kind of the mental landscape of these characters, and it does need the visuals to go with it as well. But really, I think it is actually the sound design in both of these films that takes them to another level in terms of their effectiveness. So I'm glad that both of you mentioned it, because it is quite something. Like, it's easy to spot Decker's visual style in both of these films, but I need to look up who was involved with the sound design, whether it was the same folk, because I really do think that takes both of these films up a level. Yeah.
And also I don't know again who did the score, but the score was particularly really pulsating and intense and interesting, and it exacerbated this idea of isolation and being stuck in a situation where she was having to work through.
I also kind of appreciated Michael Stuhlbarg doing the Bizarro World version of his "Call Me by Your Name" character.
Mm-hmm.
It's a variation, certainly. There's something else too. I'm glad that you mentioned the dinner table conversations, and I think you could link these two things because there's the moment, one of the dinner table conversations where they kind of cross over the 180-degree line a couple of times, but it's always next to her ears. And that's interesting because it's almost as though the conversation is the subject, it's not what people are doing. And it's as though the scenes vary between it being a particularly like dialogue specific and dialogue important scene, or a scene which focuses on gesture and acting style. Because the moment where Moss works out, Shirley Jackson walks out the house for the first time, being assisted by Rose, it's like she can't walk. She's so stunned to be leaving the house for the first time, although she kind of wants to do it. That's a moment which really emphasizes like the mask that she's assumed through staying in the house all of this time. Whereas the scene at the dinner table is all about the way in which Jackson has like precisely the right word, and when she says exactly the right word, she cuts everybody off from her emotional life.
Yeah, the it's funny everyone's mentioning the dinner table scenes, because I felt like that latter dinner table scene just after the relationship between Shirley and Rose has kind of developed a bit more. It was a really fascinating point for me, and I think it was a point where the film could have gone in one of two directions, and the direction it did go in is perhaps understandable in terms of, whilst there is this deepening of the relationship between Rose and Shirley, ultimately it is Shirley and Stanley as these incredibly archetypal kind of academic elite who just couldn't function anywhere else besides the world of academia, are really just playing with Rose and I forget the name of Rose's husband. Stanley, I think Stanley and Shirley and Rose and Rose and Fred. So
Fred,
really,
yeah.
Shirley and Stanley are just playing with these two younger characters who either will or won't go in the same direction as them. Perhaps won't because they're too mediocre. Something that gets referenced quite a lot. The idea of mediocrity being worse than being terrible because it's just nothing. And I felt like I really wanted at that moment to go in the direction where Shirley and Rose's relationship is explored more, because the ways in which that is played with are really kind of quite interesting, and it's very sexy and coy. And I mean, even actually the fact that everyone was talking about the sound design as well, the sound design and the setting of the film reminded me a lot of Peter Strickland's The Duke of Burgundy, which features these two female characters who have a kind of submissive dominant relationship between them that it plays with, and I could kind of have seen Rose and Shirley's relationship going down that route, with one is perhaps health-wise weaker, but really in her mind she's so strong that she can't be kind of stopped and crushed and kept quiet. But that dinner table scene where their relationship was probably built to the highest height it gets to, and then it very quickly just goes, and that it's just lost, and Shirley's back within kind of Stanley's bubble. And the next time we see them interact, Rose kind of goes to Shirley again looking for that connection that they've grown, and Shirley just kind of casts it aside, and it shows that they really aren't the kind of characters that can let in romance and warmth and love. They're just interested in kind of in playing with people and exploring the limits to people's tolerance, I think, to a certain extent. Just one other thing was that at the very beginning of the film, Rose has just finished reading Shirley's latest short novel, I think, The Lottery, and refers to it as thrillingly horrible. And I thought that was quite a nice moment in retrospect of watching the film, that is what the film is. It's thrillingly horrible, and the experience that they're both about to go through is exactly that. And she kind of sums it up within those first minutes of the film.
Well, I think we all agree that it's certainly beautiful and certainly interesting, and in varying degrees. But Jim, when is Shirley coming out?